Everybody thinks they know what happened. America left the World Health Organization, and the internet filed it away. Like a meme. Politics versus science, ego versus experts, end of story. Clean, simple, satisfying. But if you're still clinging to that version, I've got bad news. The real story is colder than that, and a lot more expensive. Because the WHO isn't just a health club for countries. It's a global switchboard for crisis authority. And crisis authority moves markets. Crisis authority moves money. And when money moves, power follows it like a shadow. And here's what makes this feel almost unreal. This time, it wasn't just a threat. On January 22nd, 2026, the US government announced it had completed its withdrawal from the World Health Organization after a year-long process that started with President Trump's executive order on January 20th, 2025. Not a pause, not a review, a finished exit. Funding stopped, personnel recalled, seats surrendered. That actually happened yesterday, basically. So let's kill the first myth right now. The myth is that the WHO is some neutral army of doctors that floats above politics. On paper, it looked harmless. A UN agency for health created after World War II, when the world was trying to build systems that could prevent the next catastrophe. The WHO's constitution was adopted in 1946 and entered into force in 1948. It's got that famous definition of health: complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Not just not being sick. It's poetic, almost religious. But here's the part they don't teach you. The moment you build a global institution that defines health that broadly, you've built an institution that can justify touching almost anything. Borders, labor, trade, schools, migration, surveillance, supply chains, even the way governments talk to their own citizens in a panic. And if you're thinking, okay, but it's still just advice, listen carefully. Advice becomes policy when fear is high. Advice becomes law when economies are fragile. Advice becomes a weapon when rivals are watching. The WHO is governed by the World Health Assembly, with delegations from member states and supported by an executive board made up of 34 technically qualified members. That is not a lab meeting. That is governance. That is politics wearing a lab coat. Now let's talk about the second myth, that America can't leave because the WHO is some permanent club. It's true, the WHO Constitution didn't include a withdrawal clause the way people assume, but the US reserved its own exit ramp when it joined. In 1948, Congress passed a joint resolution saying the U.S. could withdraw with 1 year's notice if it also paid its financial obligations for the WHO's current fiscal year. That's not conspiracy, that's literally the deal in writing. And that detail matters because it exposes what this really is. Not a moral relationship, not a friendship, an agreement with conditions like a contract with money clauses, a contract with a timer. That's why withdrawal is never just a health headline. It's a legal and financial headline with a health mask on. So why did America leave? The official reasons, straight from the US government's own documents, are blunt. Dissatisfaction with the WHO's handling of COVID-19, claims the WHO didn't reform, and claims it couldn't demonstrate independence from political influence. The 2025 executive order also complains about payments, framing US contributions as unfairly large compared to other countries. That's the story the administration wanted on the record. But this is where things get ugly, because those reasons are only the top layer. Underneath is the money design of the WHO itself, how it's funded, how it's steered, and how global health quietly becomes global leverage. The WHO has a budget, obviously. The approved program budget for 2024-2025 is about $6,834 billion, split across base programs, polio eradication, special programs, and emergency operations and appeals. That's not pocket change, but it's also not infinite power. It's something more dangerous. It's enough money to coordinate the world, set priorities, and create dependency in the places that can't fund those priorities themselves. And here's the mechanism most people never see. WHO funding is not just member dues. The WHO has assessed contributions, membership dues, and voluntary contributions, many of which are earmarked. Earmarked means the donor points to the bucket and says, my money goes there, not there. That sounds normal until you realize it creates a structural bias. Priorities drift toward what powerful donors want funded, not necessarily what the world needs funded. Even the WHO has described this over-reliance on earmarked voluntary funding as a risk that misaligns priorities and threatens independence. So yes, you can argue about politics and ideology all day, but the real engine is who pays, who earmarks, who steers, and who gets to claim neutrality while they steer. And the United States has historically been one of the biggest payers. Around the 2024-2025 cycle, reporting identified the U.S. as the largest single contributor and described most of WHO's budget as coming through voluntary contributions, often restricted. Again, restricted money. Directed money, power with a receipt money. Now zoom in on the timeline, because it's not one clean event. It's a saga. In 2020, during the first Trump administration, the U.S. moved to withdraw. The UN confirmed it received the U.S. notification on July 6, 2020, with an effective date of July 6, 2021, because of that one-year notice requirement. The UN also explicitly noted the conditions the U.S. had set for withdrawal: one-year notice and meeting assessed financial obligations. But that 2020 withdrawal didn't complete. President Biden reversed it immediately after taking office, sending a letter retracting the previous notice and keeping the U.S. in the WHO. Then came the second attempt. On January 20th, President Trump signed the executive order initiating withdrawal again, revoking the 2021 retraction, pausing transfers of U.S. funds, recalling personnel, and halting U.S. participation in negotiations tied to the WHO pandemic, agreement, and amendments to the international health regulations, while withdrawal was in progress. And then, January 22nd, 2026, the U.S. says it's out. Completed withdrawal. The CDC and HHS announcements describe a year-long process of stopping funding, withdrawing personnel, and shifting work to bilateral engagements. Now, if you're wondering why the international health regulations keep popping up, here's the simple version. The IHR 2005 are legally binding on 196 states parties, including all WHO member states. They were adopted in 2005 and entered into force in 2007, and the purpose and scope, says the quiet part out loud, respond to the international spread of disease in ways that avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. Traffic, that's not a footnote. That's the bloodstream of the system. Because disease doesn't just kill people. Disease disrupts labor, shipping, tourism, manufacturing, and insurance risk. Disease makes banks nervous. Disease makes investors flee. Disease turns a stable economy into a rumor. And once that happens, the battlefield isn't just hospitals, it's ports, airports, markets, and supply contracts. So when a country fights over the WHO, it's not only fighting over health guidance, it's fighting over the global alarm bell, over what gets called an emergency, over how quickly information moves, over who gets access to outbreak intelligence, over who sits in the committees where standards are shaped. And once you understand that, the emotional shouting starts to look almost childish, because the grown-up conflict is about control. But here's the part people miss when they argue in slogans. The WHO's power is weird. It's not the power of an army. It can't force your legislature to pass a law. It can't march into your town and impose a curfew. Its power is more modern than that. Its power is that it's the center of a network. Data, coordination, recommendations, legitimacy. And legitimacy is currency. Legitimacy is credit. If you want a financial analogy, think of the WHO like a global rating agency for health risk. When it speaks, governments react, companies react, airlines react, supply chains react. And then ordinary people react, because ordinary people always pay last. They pay with layoffs, price spikes, rationed care, and the silent panic of not knowing what to trust. And you can pretend none of this is about money, but then explain something for me. Why does every argument about the WHO eventually turn into an argument about who pays and who controls the agenda? Why does every health debate end up sounding like a boardroom fight? In 2022, WHO member states agreed to a financing reform, gradually increasing assessed contributions, so membership dues would represent 50% of WHO's core budget by the 2030-2031 cycle, trying to reduce dependence on earmarked voluntary money. That's the WHO and its members admitting the problem exists. If everything was pure and neutral, there'd be no need for sustainable financing reforms to protect independence. Now, let's talk about the consequences of the US leaving, because this is where you stop watching politics like a sport and start seeing the collateral damage. And that's why the WHO is always going to be political, no matter how loudly people insist it shouldn't be. Because the WHO sits where human survival intersects with national pride, and where national pride intersects with budgets, and where budgets intersect with influence. So why did America leave, really? Officially, the US government says it left because the WHO mishandled COVID-19, failed to reform, and couldn't prove independence from political influence, while also arguing the US was paying too much. Structurally, America left because the WHO is not just a health body, it's a governance hub whose funding model makes influence inseparable from money. And when the biggest payer decides the influence isn't worth the price, it doesn't just disagree, it pulls the plug. Geopolitically, America left because global institutions are battlefields now. Not with tanks, through standards, committees, data access, and legitimacy. And if you think that doesn't matter, try building a vaccine strategy without being plugged into the same global surveillance conversations everyone else is using. Legally, America left inside a gray zone that even US legal analysts have flagged for years. The 1948 Joint Resolution reserved a withdrawal right for the United States, but it doesn't clearly answer whether that means the president alone or the president plus Congress, and it conditions withdrawal on notice and financial obligations. So even the exit itself becomes a fight over who controls the signature, who controls the purse, who controls the lock on the door. And now comes the chilling part, the part nobody wants to say out loud. Leaving an institution doesn't end the problem the institution was built to manage. It just changes who's exposed when the problem returns. Viruses don't care about sovereignty. They don't care about executive orders. They don't care about speeches. They move through flight paths and shipping containers and crowded rooms where somebody had to show up to work because rent is due. And when the next alarm hits, and it will because history doesn't retire, America won't just be debating science versus politics. It'll be negotiating access, rebuilding channels, cutting side deals, buying information with money instead of membership, and discovering what it actually costs to operate without the world's health switchboard. Because on paper it looked harmless, but in reality it was a lever, and America just let go of it. So here's the line that should stick in your throat. January 22nd, 2026 wasn't the day the US escaped global control. It was the day the world learned the control was never the WHO in the first place. It was the money behind it and the panic that spends it. Major reporting on the January 22nd, 2026 withdrawal described concerns about weakened outbreak response, loss of US influence inside WHO committees, and complications around access to international disease intelligence, especially for things like influenza surveillance and vaccine coordination. And it also highlighted something that should make your skin crawl if you're paying attention. The fight over whether the president could withdraw unilaterally, because US membership was established through Congress. In other words, even the legality and completeness of leaving gets contested like a financial instrument. Who has authority, who signed what conditions were met, what money is still owed. And yes, owed money is part of this story too. Reporting right at withdrawal said the WHO considered the US to still be in arrears for dues from prior years, describing hundreds of millions owed. The US administration disputed the requirement. Notice how fast this becomes a debt fight. Because of course it does. If you're a researcher or a public health worker, this isn't abstract. Losing formal channels means more friction, more delays. More will get back to you. And in outbreaks, delay is destiny. If you're a taxpayer, the question isn't, is the WHO perfect? The question is, does paying into a global coordination system reduce the cost of the next crisis? Or does it outsource decision-making in ways you can't control? That's the real tension, but it's not going away. And if you're just a regular person trying to keep your family safe, the sick joke is that you don't get a vote in any of this. You don't sit in Geneva. You don't sit in the US budget meetings. You don't negotiate the wording of international regulations. You just live inside the consequences. And right here, midway through this mess, if you want more deep, uncomfortable breakdowns like this, hit like and subscribe. Not because it fixes anything, but because it helps push real explanations above the algorithm's usual diet of outrage candy. Now, let's pull the camera back to the darker historical pattern. Because America leaving the WHO isn't an isolated tantrum. If it's a cycle that historians recognize. Empires build institutions when they're confident, and they attack institutions when they feel constrained. After World War II, the US helped build a world of multilateral systems meant to stabilize chaos. Health became part of security, and security became part of economics. That's not some hidden plan. It's the logic of a world where disease can crash trade, and trade can crash governments.